Hello and welcome to Before Our Friends Die. You're joined by me, Kavan, and unfortunately, Rachel can't be here with us today, but never mind. I've got a very special guest with me. Anyway, Tommy, he's a social worker in London, and we're here to sort of unpick the profession. There's loads of things we don't know about social work, and we want to provide this platform to highlight it a lot more, the important work he does across London. So without further ado, Tommy, how's it going?
I'm good. Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to chatting.
Yeah. Do you know what? Like I say, the reason we wanted to reach out to you to have this chat was because you put a post on LinkedIn, and that post basically outlined what your generic day-to-day activity looks like as a social worker. And the first thing I thought was, when does this guy get a coffee? And the second thing I thought was like, wow, there's so many things I didn't know. So let's break it down for the listeners who aren't aware. From 9 till 9:30, you do admin. So you're making a dent in your emails for half an hour. And maybe this would include sending a diplomatic email to a head teacher who wants to exclude a boy on your caseload. Now, I didn't realize that you were that involved. That's the first thing that caught me on the first one. I didn't realize you're communicating with head teachers about exclusions. And what sort of conversations are you having with head teachers? Why is exclusion, very obvious question, but why is exclusion a problem for your line of work?
No, I mean, it's a really big one. I mean, maybe it'd be helpful if I gave like a little overview of the team that I'm in, the kind of stuff we do, because that kind of is the context for the exclusion stuff, really. And like, I think it's a massive thing that we deal with pretty much every day with the kind of cases that I'm working on. So I work basically in an adolescent safeguarding team, so mainly teenagers. And the kinds of cases that we deal with, it's across a few different areas. So it's edge of care cases, it's what they're called in the trade, and that basically means that the child is on the edge of coming into care. The family's kind of on the verge of breakdown, and we're trying to prevent that from happening and keep the child with the family where we can, if it's safe and appropriate. And then the other kind of cases we work on are child criminal exploitation cases, which where I work in North London is pretty much exclusively gangs cases, and child sexual exploitation as well. So they're the kind of main areas. And in terms of how that links to the exclusion stuff, I mean, unfortunately, it's really, really common that the first thing that you notice when a child starts to go towards something like, gangs or that kind of thing, is that maybe there's problems at home or there's things are starting to slip a bit at school. And the moment that they get excluded and you don't have that positive structure to go to in the day with good people around you, good teachers to look out for you, good like positive friends to be around, and you're just left to your own devices, that's when so many people kind of can go in the other direction. So a massive part of what we want to try and do is prevent that breakdown of a school place from happening in the first place, so that kids don't go in that direction, really. It's something that surprised me as well, to be honest, when I first started doing the role, is that I must admit I kind of imagined that I would be doing most of my work directly with the children or with the families, but actually such a massive part of the role when you're a social worker is dealing with all of the other professionals that are working with a child or a family in a particular case. And obviously a school's a really big part of that. So I guess when we're speaking to schools and especially heads who are on the verge of excluding, I think often I feel a lot of sympathy for them, funnily enough. But they're often in situations where they're trying to deal with massive classes. They've got way too many kids there in the first place. They don't actually have the staffing resources to deal with the situation. And they're often saying things like, we need one-on-one time with this kid so that we can actually work with them and actually try and make this happen. But we just don't have the staff to do that. And it might be that there's someone from an opposing gang at the school and there's a safety concern about two kids from the same gang being in the same corridor and, stuff kicking off, which does happen. Or outside the school gates or whatever it might be. So it's not like they're just excluding kids for the sake of it. There's kind of good reasons behind it. But I suppose we're having conversations of trying to actually help that head teacher think about what could you do or what could we do to help you kind of keep the child in the positive space of the school. So it might be stuff like thinking about which other kids are there clashes with other gangs, how could we separate timetables so that they're not going to be in the corridor at the same time, and even those like really practical flow questions. So it's a lot and a lot of interaction with schools. So that's a bit of context and why we end up speaking with schools so much, especially in those kind of cases.
That context was definitely valuable. Again, you're highlighting things I hadn't really considered. Yeah. Again, my main question is, where do you find the time? And a lot of this knowledge you're talking about, it sounds really specialist. So before we get stuck into the rest of your day, what is your start in social work? Did you study a social work degree? How did you get your start here?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very varied job, and it can be quite specialist in kind of lots of different areas. I personally didn't do a social work degree, so I actually did a politics degree, which is, yeah, well, it's not really relevant basically when you're sitting in a room with most of these cases. So I actually did a postgraduate diploma in social work via a program called Frontline. So you might have heard of programs like Teach First.
Yeah.
You can kind of go into teaching having done it. I mean, the Frontline is basically like the social work equivalent of that. So if you've done a degree, I think you have to have got a 2-1, but it doesn't matter what that degree is in, where it's from, anything like that. Then you can apply to do Frontline, and that's like a conversion course. So it takes like a year after university, and you kind of learn on the job. So like a day a week of training, which is really helpful. But on the whole, it's kind of quite experience led, because I guess there's an extent to which you can't plan so much for these things, and some of these things you can only really understand when you're in it. So it's in at the deep end. And in some ways, I think one of the problems with social work is, I guess the training really varies. It's kind of very much a thing of, I've learned probably more from just overhearing someone on the desk next to me on a call, hearing how they deal with a situation, or someone that they might speak to in a certain situation, than I have actually from that formal training. So it's very hit and miss, and I think that can be a big variation in quality sometimes with social work, which is something that I think should be improved. But yeah, so I went into it that way after university, and yeah, as you say, it's very, very varied. So can be a bit in at the deep end, but I guess that's part of the thing that makes it quite fun as well.
Politics degree, and then you do the social work equivalent of Teach First. My question is why? So when I was at university, sociology degree, teaching seemed like a fairly safe option. They brought Teach First in, for whatever reason I didn't do it, but they never brought Frontline to us, or they never came to us, shall we say. But social work, how do I say this? It sounds hard. It sounds really hard, even from the outside looking in, even not knowing all these details that you put in the average day post. Why social work? What was it that made you think this sounds, I imagine, really difficult, but I'm going to jump straight in?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the why question is one that I also sort of scream at myself sometimes when I'm being screamed at by people at work, and it's just a situation. I mean, like, yeah, it's definitely not a usual route, I suppose, to go in from doing like a politics degree or whatever and going into something frontline work style like this. I mean, to be honest, there's two reasons really. I suppose the main one is obviously that I just wanted to do something really direct, and you can't really get much more direct than social work, in the sense of, if something goes wrong, you literally drive out to the house and sort it out, or you're speaking to someone directly on the phone. There's no kind of faff with all of the back and forth emails and all this kind of stuff. It's like, it's a very, very direct thing, and I think that's really appealing, and I don't think you get that in many jobs. And I think it comes with its negatives, because it can be stressful, but it comes with its positives as well, because you then know that when you've done something, and you can see that in front of you. And I think that really appealed to me. And I think the second part of it is that actually, when I was kind of first doing kind of summer jobs at uni, and just after uni as well, I was working more on the kind of politics side of things, more in line with, I suppose, what you might expect from doing my degree.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I found really frustrating about it was that I think lots of the people who are in positions where they're making policies and deciding about what to do in people's lives actually have no idea about what goes on the ground in those people's lives, and also what happens with the services all around them, whether it be schools or social work or social care or hospitals or police or whatever it might be. And I felt that often meant that people could be quite out of touch with how things really play out in reality. So I suppose that was the second reason, is that I think if you have an interest in politics and policy and that kind of stuff more widely, really the best place to start is with what's actually happening, as opposed to just reading about it in a book. So yeah, that was the second reason. And I think, to come to your point of why social work in particular, because obviously there's so many other professions like teaching or whatever it might be you can do. I mean, I guess what's really appealing about it, and that's unusual, is that you work across so much in social work. So like, instead of you're just being based in a school, or you're just being based in a hospital, or whatever it might be, it wouldn't be unusual in a day for me to start in the office, drive to someone's flat, drive to a school for a meeting, go to a prison to do a visit, see someone in a park just for like a walk to chat about things because that's where they might speak better, drive someone through a drive-through because you have some of your best conversations in the car, end up back in a hospital because someone else you need to visit there. And so you're like constantly moving around everywhere, and you kind of see everything, and you're kind of that interface really between someone's life and then the system around them. And I think that's kind of what appeals to me about it. So yeah, it's that variety and the directness of it, I think, that really stood out.
Sounds fascinating. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you, I suppose, is what is your first exposure to social work? Because again, drawing that comparison earlier about teaching, well, we've all had teachers from a very early age. We know what that looks like. We have an idea of the day to day. I'm curious, what was your first exposure to what a social worker was or does?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this reflects badly on me, but pretty much the first exposure I had to it was when I arrived for my first day on the job, and right. that was the first time that I really understood what it was. Because I think that, to be honest, a lot of people's first exposure to social work is often in the media, where there's a very negative version of social work. I think basically the two ways that you come across social workers in the media are, number one, in tragic circumstances where children are passed away, or something really serious has happened, and people sort of say, why wasn't more done? And then the second time is social workers just take kids away, and they're just sort of evil arm of the state who come and ruin everything for families. And they're really the two narratives that you hear about social work in the media. So I must admit that was also my knowledge of it, really, from the media. It was only really when I started reading about the Frontline program that I kind of started to understand more about what social workers actually do. And then really when I actually started is when I found out 90% of what I know, because I think it's quite surprising. I think people have a very different perception about what social work is to what the reality of social work is, often in a negative way. And I think, I definitely didn't know much either before I went into it.
Let's get stuck back into your schedule then. So you've sent this email now, and then between 9:30 and 10:30, you got an hour-long team meeting. You talk over cases, particularly ones that you're stuck with, and you try and solve them as a team. You talk about having a child that you haven't really had a chance to build a relationship with, or you've tried and it just hasn't got you anywhere. So I suppose it's really good to have that team environment that you can work with. How common is that? Is that because of the way you came into the profession? Is that a core part of the profession? Again, my own lack of knowledge on social work there, I don't really know how much teams play a part in this.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I'm really lucky that I've got a great team. We're quite close, and we share ideas and experiences and kind of back each other, which is great. Teams are really common in social work. So you tend to have teams within a local authority. So social work for children is run by local authorities, and it comes within children's services, and usually have like a few services within each local authority. So you've got like an assessment service to work out all of the stuff that's coming in, assess what's happening, and like triage it, pass it to the right teams. Then you've got like a middle section, which is kind of all of the different intervention teams, how you can work with kids. So you've got like my team, which is that adolescent team with the teenagers. You've got teams that work with specific issues like maybe domestic violence, and you've got more general teams that deal with kind of standard child protection issues like neglect, violence to children, that kind of thing. And then you've also got longer term teams as well, so for like looked after children in the care system, and children who are leaving that system as well as lots and lots of stuff around that. So it's kind of split out in that way. And then within each of those service areas, you've got lots of teams of about 10 or so social workers, which have one manager, and you all hold your cases within that team, everyone with their own cases. So that's kind of the structure of it. I guess it's not necessarily always usual that you have this team meeting structure that you mentioned in that post about my day. That's called group supervision. So it's basically where you bring cases and discuss them and think of a way forwards. And yeah, it's great. We literally just sit there with a coffee around the table and literally just map out the case. What's going on? What's wrong? What can't we do? And I think, like the example that I'd given in that post that you just were talking about, I think quite often it can be stuff as simple as, I've tried to work with this kid, they've come in, they don't want to speak, it's one word answers.
Yeah.
Probably had multiple like situations where they've had social workers in the past when they were younger. It might not have worked, it might not have been someone they got on with. They've got all of preconceptions in their own heads about what social work is. And it can be really, really hard to get through times with children, families, whoever. So sometimes it's just sort of mapping out why that might be, where that kind of approach might be coming from, and then taking that back to the approach of how you go with the kids, whether it's trying to meet them in a different situation, trying to think about what's behind it and how you can address that, and those kind of things. So yeah, it's a great thing really to have that team there, and I think without the team it would be quite a lonely profession, because
I can imagine
all that risk, all of those problems, all of those difficult situations. And I think the thing that makes it doable really is having people around you who are going through the same thing, who you can speak to about it and who you can kind of have that sense of camaraderie with. So yeah, that makes it doable.
So I was looking back through the schedule that you put up there, and you talk about visiting a child in care, and she's been kicked out of college for a big fight in a classroom, and basically you found her another college and she's got an interview, but she's quite nervous. Now you offered to take her there because of those nerves. I'm curious again, how much of that is your role, but how much of that is your being, your own choice?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a mix, I think. So I'm lucky in that, because I work in quite a specialist team with teenagers, and where we're working with some of the most serious cases as well. We've actually got a slightly reduced caseload in comparison to some of the more general teams. And the idea of that is that we're meant to be able to then work a little bit more intensely with the children because of the nature of the situations and how serious it is. So I'm lucky in the sense that I have a little bit more time than I think the average social worker would to go out and do some of those things, like drive someone to something, because I've got a bit of extra time. I think also it's something that I really try to prioritize in my work with the children, because I think often people think about things in quite a rigid way of, okay, well, I need to do a visit or a conversation with a child, so they should come to the office, or we should have that as a sit down conversation over a table and talk things through. But actually, for me, I think really some of the best conversations and sessions I've ever done with children have been in the car, driving to something, having a more casual chat. And actually, I think everyone feels much more relaxed. You've kind of got that thing of being in the car, not getting eye contact, so it doesn't feel awkward. And I think it works really well. So even though it sounds like a kind of practical thing of just driving to college or something really simple like that, actually sometimes they're the best visits that you can do. So I kind of see that as an essential part of it really, as opposed to an extra, in the way that I look at things.
I really appreciate that insight, because again, I'll tell you what, I was thinking about my exposure to social workers, and Elaine the Pain from Tracy Beaker was one of the examples I could think of. Now I didn't even mention that earlier because I didn't feel like it was real, obviously, but of course, if that's our only one, we're going to take it on board as much as we can, right? Yeah, it was interesting, but yeah, I don't think I ever remember her driving around Tracy Beaker. But anyway, you then mentioned about 11:30 onwards, you divert to a police station. Someone that you work with has been arrested. You act as their appropriate adult, and you give them a lift home. They're not too chatty. You listen to music on the way home. A few things I want to pick up on there. So, if someone you're working with is arrested, are you someone that's going to get called? Is that someone the young person suggests, or how does that process work?
Yeah, so it depends is the boring answer. So if the child's family, if they're living at home and their mum or dad or another family member is about, then it should be the parent really, because
Yep.
that's kind of obviously the first port of call. Often it's the case that with families we're working with, the parents might not be around, or it might be that, you know, they aren't particularly supportive of the child sometimes, and they might refuse to come, which is really quite common.
Yep.
And in those kind of backup situations, then usually my name's first on the list.
Right.
So obviously if they're in care as well, it might be that my name's first on the list, because actually there might not be anyone else around. So yeah, I'm usually up there. And I think, yeah, it's always an interesting experience, kind of dealing with those kind of situations. I think they can be obviously really important situations for some of the kids that we work with, and they can really be crossroads in their lives as well. So yeah, they tend to be very last minute. You get the call and it's like, can you come down now? They're literally sitting there in the custody cells. Can you get here as soon as you can? But then actually it can be one of the most important things that you do in a day. So yeah, so it's an unusual one.
So how do you deal with that? Because, you know, I'm going to assume, Tommy, you haven't sat in many police interviews, you know, because you've been arrested. So so this is a new environment for you. Again, I'm assuming the first time you did it, for instance, let's say, a new environment for you. Obviously, we acknowledge that the kid may be feeling nervous, but how are you feeling? Like, how do you separate the advice you would want to give versus the professional advice to give, and the professional feelings? Like, how do you navigate all of those emotions and feelings?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. I don't think there's a simple answer to it either. I mean, I think it's something that I've probably developed a bit since I've started social work. So I guess the tendency is, when you first start social work and you're not used to, I guess, the professional role that you hold as a social worker, I feel like when you're face to face with a child who's really upset or in a terrible position or these kind of things, usually, like, as normal people, the only times we're in those situations with people we're quite close to, like family or close friends. And so the types of ways that you would react to that, of giving someone a hug or being kind of emotional with them back, isn't really appropriate when you're in that role as a social worker. But that's, I think, what most people would reach for naturally. So it can feel quite strange to, like, have to hold back on that kind of thing sometimes and keep that distance with a child, even when you know that what they really want with the people around them at that moment is some sort of connection. But I think the way that I've come to think about it is that, although it's so important to be, like, really compassionate and kind of be there for them and be that person that they can speak to in that situation, at the same time, you don't want to overstep that mark, because the sad reality is that we often only work with kids for, say, 6 months or a year, and then we step out of their lives. And if we become someone that they're dependent on, then we're kind of setting them up to fail, because the moment that I then leave their life, if they're really relying on me in all of those situations as the person they'll go to, and then I'm not there, then I haven't really done my job right, because then they're going to be a bit stuck. So really, the job is about being that person in the moment, but also trying to think in the longer term, like, who can we get into this situation in the future who's actually going to be there for them going forwards? Like, is there, like, a long lost uncle who they really like, who they don't see that much, who actually we could try and get in for situations like this, and start to build up those, like, longer term plans right at the start, as opposed to making it all about you as the worker, which is really tempting, because as a human you just want to do that. But you've sometimes got to think about it in the longer term as well. So yeah, it's about, like, being, like, emotionally present and there for them in the moment, but also thinking, how can I make it so that they don't end up kind of dependent on me as well, and that they've got a bit of a plan for the future about how they're going to deal with this, because we know that it's likely to happen again. So it's that balance really that you've got to find with it.
I tell you what, as a human being, I struggle with that. I think I struggle with, when you're offering someone advice, and I tell you what, I'll just do it for you. It's fine. That's just And then next thing you know, they still don't know how to do it because you did the last one.
Yeah.
And that's really hard. So yeah, credit to you, because it can't be easy. Did training help with that, or again, is it something you're developing and you're learning as you go along?
It's probably more the learning as you go along, I think, because it's such a kind of practical thing of where you draw the line between kind of compassion and then allowing someone to find their own feet. And it's so difficult. And I'm sure that I've got it wrong sometimes, and I don't always get it right. And I don't think you can ever get that kind of thing completely right, because it's so difficult. But yeah, I think you're right. It's a very, very strange thing to like separate out my head as like me, Tommy, who is like exists at home and how I would be with anyone else, and then that kind of strange position of like both authority but also like close you hold with the children that you work with. It's like a very, very strange balance. Kind of like part teacher, part parent, part friend, part like someone of not as dissimilar age in some cases.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of hats that you're wearing at one go. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. But I suppose one of the things, that makes it an interesting job, because even though it's hard, it is still quite an interesting thing to think about. It's quite a privileged position to be in, really, in someone's life. So yeah, it's a very interesting part of the job.
I hadn't realised as well that you're only in their lives for 6 to 12 months or whatever. But obviously you can change the course of their lives. You mentioned earlier about a crossroads. You could tell them to go left when they were going to go right or whatever, and that can have a real major impact on the trajectory of their future. So what a privilege. Definitely what a privilege. So we've spoken about the challenges, some of the rewards as well of the role. I'm going to say this last final piece about the average day that you wrote up, and I encourage you to connect with Tommy on LinkedIn as well if you get a chance. We'll put the link down below. Between 5 and 5:30, you're frantically writing up case notes onto the system from the car before driving home. While I've said that, I'm also going to say, what's the worst part of your job? Because I'm going to assume it is the paperwork.
Well, you've assumed very well. One of the very worst parts of it, really. I mean, probably as well, 5 to 5:30 is generous. I think I would often longer than that, and it's often kind of spread throughout the day, and it's a lot. And I think it is a shame. I think I've heard from so many other social workers as well the experience of literally seeing your phone ring with one of the families that you're working with, and you can't take it because you're writing about the family on the system and it had to be done at a certain deadline. It's this kind of ridiculous situation where you're not able to actually do the job of helping them because you're writing about them, and it's just it's frustrating. And I think it can get quite a lot. I mean, I think it is a price worth paying for what we were just talking about, which is that very privileged position in people's lives. And, I guess that most jobs have a lot of paperwork, and most jobs probably are, 90% paperwork. So it's nice that actually, at least in this job, it's not 90%. You're still going around, you're doing your visits, you're going out and about. There's not a day that I'm usually just ever only in the office. So I think that's still pretty unusual in comparison to other professions. But no, it's definitely challenging. And I think that the other side of it as well, that's the challenging part of the job, is just that it can be quite stressful. I think you're dealing with really difficult situations. You're often like coming into the life of a child or a family at like probably the worst point in their in many cases. Like you're not going to get much worse than the situations that they're finding themselves in. And often, to be completely honest, people aren't too happy to see you when you first turn up. It's that image thing, it's the preconception thing, and it's the fact that, to be honest, in those situations, the last thing they want to do probably is to have to go over all of that with someone who they've never met before and trust them with that. So people can be angry or upset or not pleased to see you and these kind of things. I guess maybe this is like my masochistic side, but I quite enjoy the challenge sometimes of like going in at a low point and then trying to end at a high point and gradually building that trust in that relationship. And some of my favourite cases have been the ones where the first time I've met them, they've told me to F off and not spoken to me for the rest of the session and walked out the room. And it makes it more rewarding where by the time you finish work with them, then actually they might be in a situation where they phone you. And I had that with a kid I was working with the other day. He was like big into a local gang. He was very unwilling to work with me, to be honest, for like the majority of the time that he was on my caseload. And I must admit, I thought it was one of the ones where I had not really done that much and I hadn't really achieved what I wanted to achieve with him. Because I just never got that connection. And then he turned 18, so he closed to our service because we only work with under 18s. And he phoned me the other day. Now he's 19, 20, saying, "Oh, I actually turned things around a bit after that," and asking me for advice about where I could link him up with like a local job provider and all this kind of stuff. And like, it was one of those ones where actually that was so much more rewarding than one of those ones where actually they're on side from the beginning and it's all sailing all the way through, because it kind of meant something that he had actually been listening that whole time, even though he hadn't said anything. So yeah, it was I think even though it can be stressful and there's a lot of paperwork and all that kind of stuff, it balances it out with the positives you get from it as well.
I tell you what, don't know if you can hear that, but I did just press the applause button, so you should be able to hear it come through. Also, we were going to ask you, can you tell us like a successful story? And you've already answered that question. Like that must be one of the best feelings ever, particularly when you feel like you didn't do what you wanted to do, but it still turned out all right. And I think that's the human element of it, isn't it? Like, not everyone's going to engage the way you envision them engaging, but sometimes they will absorb the messaging and sometimes it will work anyway, which is real powerful. So yeah, man, that must be amazingly rewarding. How do you keep track of those rewards? And I suppose it's not just the rewards, but how do you deal with, your own decompression? Because I imagine it being a stressful job, you must have to decompress some way, somehow. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It can be hard to switch off when you've got stuff that is, happening overnight as well sometimes with children that you're working with. So yeah, it can be a tricky one. I mean, I do a few things. We've got a new football thing going at work where the children's social care team play the youth offending team, and I must admit that gets quite spicy. So
wicked.
That's a good one. We can all take out our anger on each other, and it goes quite well. So that's a new thing, and I play in a band. So
love that. What do you play?
I play keyboards. So
hey, go on.
Yeah. So that's that helps. So yeah, I get up to lots outside of work, and I don't think you could really do it without doing that, because I think if you just only thought about it, you'd burn out and you'd be gone. So yeah, it's essential really.
Yeah. London. So London's a big place. London's a multicultural place. Couple questions on London. So although London's a big place, I imagine I don't actually know if you work in the area, you live in the area you work in. But if you do and you're out of hours, how do you navigate those sort of interactions? Because inevitably you must meet some of the kids you're working with, and it's like, how do you do that?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, luckily I live in North London as well as working in North London, but not exactly the same part. So I don't often bump into the children or families I work with, but I do still bump into them enough for it to be a thing. And I think, it's an interesting one. I think in particular with lots of the boys I work with who are in gangs, I have, let's say, come across them in context that it's something that we need to speak about when we next have a session. And I think that that's one of those interesting parts of the job, is that it does make you realize, like, obviously 99% of what is happening with these kids' lives is happening when you're not with them, and 99%. And so it is one of those things that obviously you're going to bump into people, and it is just that human thing of just speaking about it and not being too awkward about it, because it is just going to happen. And I think, it's an interesting one. I think especially with families where maybe at the beginning they're not too keen on seeing you as well, and you haven't quite had that chance to build up the relationship. And that I've had some interesting encounters in supermarkets where we've ended up having being on the end of some heated discussions in the canned goods aisle. So yeah, it can be interesting. I mean, I think you've just got to kind of take it as being a funny part of the job. And it's always been okay for me, but I think I wouldn't choose to live in the same borough I work in. I know some of my colleagues do, and it can lead to some interesting situations. So yeah, luckily I haven't had that too much, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting part of the job.
Resilience. You must have that in bucket loads, because that sounds a little bit tricky. Being in Sainsbury's, getting your lunch for the week, and or other supermarkets are available, and getting your lunch for the week, and wow, interesting. another thing as well about sort of London, obviously being a multicultural place, there must be I think I was going to say students. Then there must be young people you interact with who you don't necessarily represent. But
Yeah.
how do you navigate those sorts of challenges, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and especially in my team as well, where we're talking about some of those issues, especially about gang involvement in my area, because of like the demographics of the area I work in. It's are really like overrepresented in our team is children and families from black backgrounds and from other like ethnic groups. And obviously, as a white man working in London, I'm actually pretty rarely representative of the children I work with, not only from like a race perspective, but from a class perspective as well. And even from where I grew up outside of London. So in a way, I'm like a really unlikely person to be in those situations. And I guess the two things that I always think about it are like, one, there's some things that I'm never gonna understand from a personal perspective because I've got that privilege of, in my interactions with the police, for example, being a white guy who has not been pulled over and stopped and searched or profiled in a particular way, ended up in a police station through no fault of my own. And often I'm sitting alongside a kid I'm working with who is not that lucky, and who I've just got to be really, really wary of that side of things in terms of how I'm able to support them, and also understanding the limits of how I can support them on that personal front, and where actually there's going to be other people in the team who might be from the same background or people in their family as well, who I can link them up with to have some of those conversations as well, because I think an important part of it is kind of understanding the limits of it as well. So I think that's a really key bit. And then I think the second thing is as well, not pretending to be someone that you're not. I think lots of times people try and like get down on the level with people that they're not necessarily like, and I think that children can see straight through that, and it isn't actually the way to go about it at all. So I think that the second part is just being really honest to yourself about it, and about what position you hold and the privileges that you hold, and basically trying to just be wary of that in the way that you're dealing with those situations. So it's definitely something I come across a lot in the communities that I work in, and especially the types of cases that I'm working with as well. I think it's a huge deal in London, and something that I'm definitely very wary of.
Again, so thanks for that answer. I mean, to give you some context as well about what this podcast is all about, this is about having the conversations we want to have before we leave this planet. And sometimes those can be really, really urgent conversations. Other times it's about speaking to people who are doing things we want to do and getting a handle on how they did it. Often it all stems from curiosity. Again, I opened this up by saying we didn't know much about social work, but having heard what you just said there about arguably the lack of representation on the professional side in terms of service providers, but not necessarily as service users, maybe there's an opportunity there for us to put that spotlight on frontline. If that's the way you got in, don't necessarily need a social work degree, which requires 3 years worth of study and placements and all sorts of things. Frontline might be an option for you. So if you're interested, we can put the details as well to Tommy's post and Frontline in the description, so you can check it out, because I think it's really, really important that those who are interested and members of the community as well do jump in and give it a go, because it's crying out for it by the sounds of things.
Yeah, definitely. I think the massively most important thing with social work in some ways is representation, because you're dealing with situations where your background and demographics and all of those kind of things are some of the key things that are playing into the situations as well. And some of the very best social workers that I've worked with are from the local community, and they've gone through some of those things themselves even, and have then decided to go into social work afterwards. And I think that without that representation, a lot of social work can be then more out of touch, and it's going to ultimately be less effective as well. So yeah, I definitely massively encourage people to check out Frontline, and there's other options as well. Like if you happen to be working in your local community and you're from an area and you want to work in the community that you're from, then you can go through apprenticeship schemes as well. So say you're like a youth worker in an area or something like that, then you can do apprenticeships to get into social work as well. And again, some of like the really best social workers that I've ever met have come through those schemes as well. So yeah, definitely a really big deal, and would back that.
Fantastic. Last few questions from me now on this one. And unfortunately, they're quite challenging as well. It's worth prepping you for that.
Yeah.
How do you feel knowing that you can't help everyone that needs it? So to give you some context as well, in preparation for this episode, I reached out to a few trainee social workers I know who were doing the degree, and just sort of said to them, what sort of questions have you got? Like, I've got a guy who's doing it. So if you have any questions, let me know. And they said they really, are challenged by the idea that not every intervention they're going to make is going to work. Not every child they work with, they can help or they will change. How do you deal with that, and how do you feel?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think one of the biggest kind of culture shocks, if you like, to get used to with social work was the thing of, I think lots of people think about maybe social work as you're going into a bad situation and you're trying to end it with the situation being absolutely brilliant.
Right.
And unfortunately, because of the really high caseloads, the lack of resources, and also just the nature of the system is that often you're really taking it from a really bad situation to kind of a good enough situation. And actually, your job is to try and set it up so that in the future it can be amazing. But often you're not going to be involved at the point that it gets to being amazing.
Yeah.
Because you will have to move on to the next person to try and get them to that situation where at least that's a possibility. So I think a lot of it is about trying to like think about yourself as part of a wider system and a wider journey that child goes through, and not trying to necessarily take it all onto your own shoulders, but actually trying to think, okay, well, I need to get this child to a situation where, like, A, I've really understood their situation, I know what's going on, B, I know what needs to happen, and the child and the family agree with me and that they're on board with that. And then the third part is really almost being like that link point with the wider kind of professional world, about getting them set up with stuff that's going to stay with them long after I'm gone, whether it be like a new training thing or a new job or a new community group which they can go to for advice and mentoring and that kind of thing. And actually, I mean, on that subject, it really comes back to what we were just talking about with representation as well. Sometimes the best thing I can do is put people in touch with like a community group that's really representative of their own community, where actually they're going to be able to like get so much from that in a way that actually sometimes from our conversations we're not going to touch on some of those things. So it's about even getting them more opportunities than they would be able to get just through me, and that might suit them really, really well. And so yeah, it's about, I guess, seeing yourself as part of that network and giving people access to that. I think that's how you've got to see it. Otherwise, I think, yeah, people's questions are right in saying that. Otherwise, you're going to think, when I leave, what's going to happen? I can't help them anymore. There's people that are able to help, and I think you've just got to take the wins when you can get them, and then basically give people access to as much good stuff as you possibly can. And I think that's the key, so that it's working even when you've left.
It sounds like you're really good at compartmentalizing in your mind. Like you say, switching off and putting things in a box so that actually you can take them for what they are, rather, because I think we're all a bit guilty of fantasizing that if I do this, it's all going to be perfect and all going to be fine. But one thing you alluded to earlier was about not letting perfect get in the way of good, and I think that's a really good way of approaching particularly human issues like this. Humans are so unpredictable and things change all the time. There's no way you could come in as an individual or even as a team and fix every challenge that this family or the child is facing, because it's just not humanly possible, I don't think. So it's really interesting that you think of it that way. A few of the other questions they asked was, how do you maintain strong personal boundaries? So they told me this, that basically support costs money, and you might have a family that you want to support. And this is from the local authority, but the local authority don't have the money that you need to pay for the support that you want. Yeah. How do you maintain those strong personal boundaries? Because what's going to stop you as an individual from saying, all right, this one time I'll pay for the course, or I'll pay your petrol, or I'll do this, how do you stop that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that stops it pretty effectively is not getting paid too much. But yeah, no, I mean, it's a good point, because I think there's so many situations where, especially after so much of the cuts to local authorities and to local services, you find yourself in really frustrating positions where you've done some great work with a child or a family, and you've worked out what needs to happen, and then you actually go to make that happen and you can't, or there's a 6 waiting list, or a year-long waiting list, or whatever it might be. Or even small stuff when you're like at a house and someone needs some, I don't know, they can't pay for a travel card, which means they can't get to their interview for their job, which means that little things where that if I just paid like this 10 quid or whatever it is, that would make a really big difference. And I think, to be fair to where I work and the team I'm in, you do have access, or in lots of local authorities as a social worker, to like a business debit card, which I carry around with me. And as long as I've had it signed off by my manager, who's usually pretty up for small things like that, when it comes to little one-off things like that, then usually there is something we can do, or if you're persuasive enough with the right people, you can usually get a little bit of money to help in certain circumstances. But I guess the danger is that obviously that's not really the role of social care. And again, it comes back to that dependency issue of, when we close the case, if they've then become reliant on extra money from us and we leave, then actually you can leave people in a worse position than when you started, because then they're going to be in debt as well as all of the issues that you've got. So I must admit, I do find that actually one of the hardest bits of the job, because it's so hard to be boundaried about it when you know that there's little things that you could do. But again, it's kind of about having to think it in that longer term of, you don't want to set people up to fail in terms of them being reliant on something that in your heart of hearts you can't sustain. And so in that sense, lots of what I actually end up doing with them is, especially when it comes to money stuff, is just because I know the system quite well now, having worked in it for a while, whether it be that housing benefit system if it's people in social housing, or whether it be like benefits for people with disabilities, or these kind of things. I've come across most of these things quite a lot of times now, and I'm aware of exactly where the pots of money are and how you access them when you're entitled to them. And I think often the problem is that people don't know what they're entitled to, and that means that actually they're missing out on things that they're perfectly entitled to, and that would really help them invest in their futures and actually get to a position where they don't need it anyway. So lots of it's linking people up and helping them navigate that system, and I think that's really the best way of doing it, because then that that's going to work for them even when you're gone, and it's not just something where you've done it as a little one-off, but actually then what's going to happen when you're not there. So I think that's the way you have to think about it. But again, you're right, it is difficult. There's no really way around that. It is really hard. But I think that's how you've got to look at it.
Just wanted to pick up on what you've mentioned a couple of times now about community organisations and the power of community, particularly in your avenue of work. So you've worked in social work for what, 4 years now, you said? Yeah. So I don't know if you would have seen this change over the last 4 years, but certainly the media suggests that over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a huge decline in community organisations, community leaders, people within the community who are willing to help support because of funding, because of, governmental funding as well. What sort of impact has that had, or are you familiar with that, first of all? And then if so, what sort of impact has that had on your profession and on the provisions you can, provide?
Yeah, I mean, very familiar, and a big impact. I mean, it is really the key to like lots of social work, is that community stuff, because without that you can end up in kind of ridiculous situations where, like I say, you've kind of done all the planning of what needs to happen, and then you can end up in a stupid situation where you're speaking to a family being like, right, this is what I think needs to happen, but actually I can't really offer you
oh man
it need to happen. So obviously you've got to be careful about it and try and tailor the plan to what exists. But I think it can be small things. So it can be stuff like if a child needs mental health support and you're referring them into the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, or CAMS, which has like massive shortages and all these kinds of things. The waiting list can often be 6 months, 12 months, like really, really long, even just for that initial session. And so you find yourselves in really difficult positions where stuff that needs to be done now is likely to sometimes only happen after you've actually stopped working with the child. So that can be quite tricky. But then also just in terms of the community stuff as well, is that I think often, like let's say we're speaking about an issue like gang involvement or something like that, I think there's like a common misconception amongst some of the policy people or people looking at this from the high, more government levels.
Yeah.
That the way that you deal with that is to punish people really hard, and then that's going to suddenly solve everything. And it's like, you know, no one's condoning some of the bad things that happen. At the same time, what's the better way of actually stopping that from happening in the first place? Like,
exactly.
Think about this from like a purely practical perspective and nothing else. Is that the best way to stop that child from doing that is to give them something better to do. And unless you can give them something better to do, then what am I supposed to offer? Like, you can't offer something that is better than something that earns you money, means you can spend time with your friends, ride around in fast cars, be the main guy in your community, all this kind of stuff. Like, it's really hard to beat that in terms of when you're saying what you can offer. And unless you've got something good that you can say, let's do this, it's a bit like I'm turning up empty-handed. So I think for me, it's like absolutely essential that if we want to combat some of those massive problems, then all that you've really got to do is invest in stuff that's better for these children to be doing, which is safe and positive. Because otherwise, I think we're going to be stuck in the same situation and having the same conversation 10 years down the line, as we have been for many years. So yeah, I think it's kind of the key for me.
Is that things like youth clubs, work experience, opportunities? Even before I started post 16, there was EMA which got cancelled just before I started. That was like paying you money to go to college or paying you money to go sixth form. My brother got that. He used it very wisely. Apparently, if you listen to him, I didn't get it. Do you know what I mean? Maybe it would have kept some of my cohort in, rather than just going straight for a job or not going for a job, finding a quicker way to get, you know, more instant funds. Yeah, it's interesting actually to think about the way slowly but surely they've just taken away all that support.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to say that I think the other thing about it, and obviously this is less important than the fact that it's the right thing to do for children because it's better and it's safer and it's more compassionate and humane.
Yeah.
The other side of it is it's way cheaper if you do it that way around.
Yeah, it's true. It's
way, way, way cheaper. If you take a preventative approach to these things, like those kids that come into care, some of those placements are what, 10 grand a week? They're unbelievably expensive.
Wow.
So if you think about that with a child coming into care at the age of, I don't know, 14, think about how many weeks that is until they're 18 that you're then paying for. Like, really, unless you invest in stopping that from happening in the first place, then it's as well as anything else, it's a waste of money. And equally with the gang side of it, for example, I mean, we've got all of these boys being locked up at a young age with big police interventions that cost absolutely tons of money, when all it would have taken probably is, I don't know, giving them paying for their like training sessions at the local football club, which would cost, you know, 50 quid a month or something, when you end up then paying thousands and thousands of pounds a week for other stuff because things have gone wrong. So for me, it's absolutely like a compassionate moral issue, but it's also a money issue. And actually, if we spent it better, there'd be more to spend on reinvesting in all these things.
Yep.
It's really frustrating for me that the money's spent at the wrong end. We spend it when it's gone wrong to mop up the mess instead of spending it at the beginning to stop it from happening in the first place.
Makes you wonder what the government really want. Right. So this job seems to have equipped you with loads of important skills that are transferable as well. You know, having those difficult conversations is such a valuable skill, particularly in this climate, being able to navigate those. Being compassionate, knowing the multitude of different support services available, building relationships, all sound like positive skills. So I'm envisioning a lot of the audience being prospective social workers or just intrigued members of the community. So I really appreciate you sharing your story with that. One final thing to ask you from a student social worker, I think this is pure curiosity. How many caseloads do you have?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, like I said, so I'm in a team with a slightly reduced caseload, which is lucky. and I'm also part-time, which maybe we'll come to briefly in a minute. So I work 2 days a week. So I'm probably a bit lower than most people. I think I'm currently on 15 families at the moment.
Wow. And that's part-time.
Yeah.
And reduced.
Yeah. So if I were full-time and in the normal generic team without reduced caseload, some people are pushing 40. And the thing that you can't do on 40 cases is actually do the job, because all of those things that I was mentioning earlier of driving someone to a college thing and having that great conversation, or spending that time being able to like properly liaise with a school about how you can help stop that kid being excluded. You can't do that if you've got that many cases, because that takes time. So yeah, that's the massive problem in social work at the moment, is that there aren't enough social workers and there's a lot of problems, and that means that things can be pretty overloaded. So yeah, I'm lucky that we've got that slightly reduced caseload, and I'm part-time anyway. But yeah, it's not an easy part of it.
Tommy, thanks so much for sharing that insight into social work. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time. Tommy mentioned earlier that he's part-time, and we're going to get into that in part 2. So make sure you tune in next week so that you can hear us as we get to know Tommy a little bit more. We'll find out what he does when he's not a social worker, when he's working the other part of his life. Inside uni. So if you're interested in learning some more about that, please do tune in next week and we will share that episode with you. If you're interested in getting involved in the conversation, please do follow us on Instagram at Before Our Friends Die Pod, or at akhi&saltfish on Instagram and Twitter. And don't forget, if you want to leave us a 5-star review, we'll really appreciate it. And if you've got any questions or comments for us or our guests, please do email akhi&saltfish@gmail.com. I've been Kavan. This has been Before Our Friends Die on the Akhi&saltfish Digital Network, and we're really grateful to our guest Tommy for sharing his social work journey. Like I said, tune in for part 2 next week, where we just get to know Tommy a little bit more, including his other job. So catch you soon.